Matters of race and power, they hover over all of this, and federal agents are now in American cities. And this week, Attorney General William Barr was challenged about all of this by Representative Pramila Jayapal, a Washington State Democrat.
When white men with swastikas storm a government building with guns, there is no need for the president to, quote, activate you because they're getting the president's personal agenda done. But when black people and people of color protest police brutality, systemic racism, then you forcibly remove them with armed federal officers, pepper bombs, because they are considered terrorists by the president. Did I get it right, Mr. Barr?
I have responsibility for the federal government and the White House.
Geoff, you were in Atlanta this week to cover Representative Lewis's funeral. You also cover the president. What should cities, Americans expect as this election nears?
Well, I think you can expect the president to try to exploit racial divisions in the way that he has done. He has sort of fashioned himself as what he likes to call a law and order president. And the way that he has done that is to call out cities, mostly black and brown major urban areas like Chicago, like Detroit, and try to suggest that those are Democrat-run cities that have explosions of crime and violence, and try to draw a link between what's happening there and to suggest that if Joe Biden is elected, then what is happening in cities like Chicago and Detroit will be happening all over the country. That's sort of the implicit, in some cases explicit argument that President Trump is trying to make. But it doesn't appear to be working. The president's pitch is not reaching the white voters in suburbia, who he, in a tweet earlier this week, referred to as suburban housewives, in the way that he wants. It's not borne out in the polls.
Kaitlan, when I was in Texas this week listening to the president, I kept hearing him railing against the left wing, the so-called mob. Not a lot of talk of Vice President Biden. Inside the White House, when you're talking to Trump sources, would they rather run against that idea, that characterization of the left, rather than Biden himself?
I think that's what they initially planned on doing when the Democratic field was large and the views on there were expansive. But now what they're running into is that it's hard to label Joe Biden as that, because he's repeatedly pushed back on their efforts to do so, namely with the president recently saying that Joe Biden wanted to defund the police, though Joe Biden expressly said that he did not want to do that. And things that make that more difficult is when Joe Biden does make these appearances and he does take questions from reporters, which he did for the first time in quite some time recently, and he said he did not want to defund the police, but also he said he believed that those who violate the law should be held up to it and should be prosecuted for doing so. That comes as we've been seeing what's happening in Portland and other places, and Biden was making clear where he stood on that. So that's why it's a struggle for the president to really label him as that, and he hasn't been successful at it. And aides lament the fact that he's sometimes picking fights with people like Dr. Anthony Fauci on his own team instead of people like the former vice president, who he's going to be on the ballot next to in November.
Susan, what does this infusion of race and this talk of law and order mean for the Biden campaign as the vice president moves closer to his vice presidential pick? Many black women are being considered for that position, as well as Senator Warren and others. But there could be a black woman soon on the Democratic ticket as the president moves in this direction.
Yes, and that would be groundbreaking. I think that is likely to happen. I think he's promised to have a woman. I think given the moment that he's in, the idea that it would be a woman of color, I think that is a really strong possibility. But I think when he looks at, I think when the Democrats in general and the Biden campaign in particular look at what the president is doing, they believe that this is not the same America that it was, say, in 1968, when appeals to law and order and racially tinged appeals got a lot of traction in that election. In this election, the suburbs are not all white. The suburbs are now more diverse than they used to be. The nation is more diverse than it was in 1968 or even in 1980 and more recently. And they're counting on a different American electorate to see these appeals in a different way than America has sometimes in the past.
John, can you pick up on that point about 1968? What's different now? What's the same?
Well, what's different now is we have a much more integrated society. Those kinds of appeals that Susan talked about are offensive to many people who are in the electorate that Donald Trump needs to get. I talked to Lynn Vavreck today, the co-author of Identity Crisis, political scientist, and what she noted in our conversation today was she wrote about how Donald Trump successfully in 2016 shifted the area of debate in the campaign to an area that he was comfortable with. Well, that's what he's trying to do here with issues of violence and the cities and anything other than what he is actually facing, which is three very tough issues on race, on the economy, on COVID. He was successful in 2016 in shifting the territory. That is much harder to do now. Why? Because reality is keeping everybody's focus on those three big problems. You can try to talk about another issue, but implicit in the job of being president is you're supposed to handle those big three problems. And polls have shown us again and again that Americans are disappointed with the president's handling of the problems. He might want to talk about something else. America wants to talk about those three things.